this year's World Model UN Day MUN Summit. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. MUN Talks is not something that we usually do live, but as a part of this year's celebrations, we decided to record this special episode live with our special guests, of course. So thanks for joining. We will have about 25 minutes, and during the session, during the panel, if you do have questions at any point, you should be able to see a Q&A button on the right side of your screens or the chat function. You could address your questions there to our panelists, to our guests, and I'd be happy to address them at the very end. Without further ado, let me introduce our guests, starting with Anthony Rostron. Anthony is a final year undergrad student at London School of Economics and Political Science. He's been joining Model UN conferences since high school, which is pretty impressive. Most recently, he was the Undersecretary General of Academics at London International Model United Nations 2023. He has also worked in public affairs consulting, which, in his words, provided him a steady stream of nonsense from the UK government. Anthony, thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And moving on with Darius. Darius is a third-year student of European Studies at Maastricht University in Netherlands and an incoming War Studies student, a master's student at King's College London. He was the Undersecretary General of Academics at Eurum in 2022, and he's also the Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Institute for Greater Europe. Darius, thanks for joining us. It's also a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining. Given our time limitation, I'm just going to go ahead and start bombing the two of you with some of the questions, which I'm sure our audience is also interested in. So I'm going to go ahead with some general questions. I know both of you have served as the Undersecretary Generals of academics in major conferences, Live-18, Eurum, and these are big names in Europe for anyone who's doing MUN, a role which I believe, and I'm pretty certain, takes a lot of time, energy. It takes a toll on your body as well, I assume. So what was the motivation behind it, and why you think it was important? Either of you could start.
I mean, yeah. I can go because I think for me it's relatively straightforward. I mean, I discovered MUN obviously joining university, and I found myself feeling like the thing that makes Model United Nations unique is the academic part, because I mean, you can party in other contexts, you can visit other cities in other contexts, and those are all very nice aspects of Model UN conferences. But ultimately, I think the academics are the part that I enjoy the most, and so also the one I was interested in organizing most. So yeah, pretty straightforward,
but pretty self-explanatory as well. So thank you, Anthony. Please.
Sure. Yeah. I think you do have a point there that it does take up a lot of energy. There were certainly points, and I'm sure Darius can sympathize with points in the conference lead up where you're quite exhausted. But for me, sort of the kind of primary motivation for this, slightly different to the cities and academics generally, is kind of this shift that I noticed in at least the European circuit from the typical sort of loudness that gets sort of upheld in Model UN, and a shift from that towards diplomacy and accessibility of Model UN to people who may not have done it before, and people who kind of prefer more pragmatic approaches to Model UN rather than any sort of confrontational approach. And so for me, with Live-18 specifically, this was an opportunity to kind of push that paradigm shift a little bit further and influence delegations that come from all over the world and try and push that diplomacy side a little bit more. And I think with academics specifically, that's really where that comes to light. You're essentially, in my briefs, I'm sure Tarek would remember as a chair at Live-18, in my briefs, I'd say like, okay, look, I'm in charge of all the words that come out of your mouths in debate. That's how I kind of like to see academics. And so with that, it was a great opportunity to really kind of capitalize on the changes that have been happening and continue to push that forward, because I personally think that's quite a positive change.
And it is a positive change, but it's also an important one. And this is why I was wondering about the motivations behind you undertaking these responsibilities, so to say. I know you kind of touched upon this already. I mean, both of you did, but undersecretaries general, they do a lot of work, a lot of reading, which Anthony mentioned a good number of times during Lyman. A lot of, I guess, sleepless nights to ensure academic excellence during the conference, throughout the conference, not only prior to the conference, but also throughout the conference. Was there an instance, I guess, where you thought it was genuinely too much? This is just, at the end of the day, extracurricular work. Most of us don't really get paid for this kind of stuff. And it's just too overwhelming. Was there that kind of an instance that either one of you had?
I guess
Yeah.
There was one particular point where it did almost feel like that. Obviously, I still kind of lived to tell the tale and put it through. But it was the day before study guides were due to be published for Lyman. And I very distinctly remember I was on a Zoom call with the USG of chairing, Philip, and the both of us were just chewing through changes and edits that still needed to be made. Because when you have sort of 70 chairing staff, it's very hard to get everyone to fall in line with the deadlines that you set. And that obviously leads to a lot of work piling up towards the end of the process. And so there was a lot of reading. And after crunching the numbers, it was around about over 250,000 towards 300,000 words of all the study guides. And you can imagine when it's 2:00 in the morning and you're on a Zoom call and you're still editing and reading, there was that kind of point where I just sat there thinking, like, my God, how am I going to do this? This is a little bit too much at that point. But at the end of the day, I guess to kind of put a positive spin on it, we did end up pushing through. I think that kind of highlighted as well the cooperation aspect and teamwork aspect, because it wasn't just me and the USG of chairing, it was also the rest of the secretariat as well at this conference had helped in reading, reviewing, and editing these study guides as well. And so it was very much appreciated, especially at that sort of the darkest hour, if you could put it, in terms of studying, in terms of publishing the study guides. And they were ultimately published, and I think they were quite good. So that was definitely one point. And I think that inevitably comes up with any sort of secretarial position that you take up with these kind of big conferences. I'm sure Darius could definitely kind of build on that a little bit more.
No, definitely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think when you mention that it's not sort of you don't do the job yourself, I can't agree more with that. Although I will say that one of the problems that I had in my experience as a USG of academics was, I came into the role as someone who had done 1.5, maybe just about 2 years of MUN. And I came into this role sort of with a very formalized idea of what Undersecretary General of Academics is supposed to be. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to take advice from the people who came before you. On the contrary, I think it's a very good idea. But we had this idea that you had to have a team of like 10, 11 people doing academics. And so that's what I went for. But that was a mistake ultimately, because the team was more of a hindrance than it helped, which is not because they weren't good. They were all excellent. It's just that ultimately the team should be tailored to the tasks to do and not the other way around. And that took me a while to realize. But one thing I would say is always sort of a lot of work, regardless of whether you have a team or not, is actually at the conference itself. Because everything before the deadlines to hand in the study guides, for instance, that can be organized in a way where you have, multiple deadlines, repeated checkups, and sort of spread across a few months. Whereas the 4 days of the conference, I think Lyman is 4 days as well, Yerman certainly is. Over the 4 days of the conference, you don't have much time to spread out your work. So that can get, I think, tough in terms of reading through all the amendments, seeing if they make sense, seeing if they're in line with sort of international law or if they're plausible. I'd say at the conference, that's probably the hardest part, honestly.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, and it was interesting, especially when Anthony pointed that out, because there are, well, obviously this depends on the very conference or the society that we're talking about, but in some instances there are like clear lines between the responsibilities of, say, USG chairing and USG academics or other members of the secretariat. But then, especially when it comes to the USG academics, who is doing a lot of academic work, obviously there's a bit of an overlap there, right? And I think that's what you were referring to, Anthony. Am I correct?
Yes,
Between the
exactly.
other USGs and members of the secretariat.
Yeah, I mean, with Lyman specifically, in before I believe it was 2021, it was just a USG of chairing, and the USG of chairing would hire a chairing officer, and they would kind of be a de facto academics person. And it wasn't until 2021 where the USG of academics actually came into existence. But as you were alluding to, these roles intertwine and overlap a lot. I would sort of help Philip with any sort of chair staffing stuff. He would then kind of reciprocate and help me with any sort of academics stuff. I think specifically with those two roles, they did sort of go together quite well. But then it's also the rest of the secretariat, as you mentioned. It's kind of texting our Slack channel at quite a late hour and being like, hey, can someone perhaps jump onto this study guide and look at this? And I think Darius raised a really good point as well with the sort of in-conference time as well, because it's not just like amendments and other things like that, but issues of plagiarism, issues of academic misconduct that need to be investigated, sending emails to chairs. That's also where collaboration with the wider secretariat comes in, and they do prove very helpful. It's great to have a team like that.
Definitely. And it's also interesting to see how those bureaucracies within the secretariats change how new positions open, because that distinction that you made, which started with Lyman after, I think you said 2021, is something that still is not a very common practice, as far as I'm concerned, at least in most of the South and East Asian conferences, I would say, or at least the ones that I am following, where, as you said, the USG chairing is also low-key acting as like the USG academics, or with some, help. But it's interesting how it's constantly innovating itself, these new positions. Obviously, a lot of work. We spoke about a lot of responsibility. If I were to address somewhat of a personal question then to each of you, what is the one thing that you believe contributed the most to your personal development, not necessarily academic, while undertaking these roles and responsibilities? Either one of you can go ahead.
Let Darius go ahead first.
All right. I mean, I think for me, when it comes to, as you said, personal development, not necessarily academic, although I suppose it also has sort of implications for academic development, it's really this realization that, sort of everyone cooks with water. I mean, again, I mentioned that I sort of came into this role, and MUN is sort of a slightly larger conference. It's more well known than others maybe. And I did have doubts throughout whether I could sort of live up to the expectations, and whether I would do it correctly, and whether I would do it well, etc. And I think the biggest thing that's sort of helps anyone, frankly, but also me in that situation, was going around meeting other people also in the same role, other USGs academics from other conferences. And also, honestly, professionals in the field that work, let's say, in the UN, and noticing that, in the end, you just do your best, mistakes happen, and people make the same mistakes no matter whether they're, in the first year of MUN or not.
Yeah, I guess from there, sort of building on the similar sort of point, it was adjusting and accepting different work ethics and work styles that chairing staff use, because you're inevitably bound to run into different work styles from what I personally may use. But this isn't a bad thing. I mean, everyone works to their own way, and at the end of the day, it reaps the same results. So it still ultimately works. But it was sort of at the beginning, I had one sort of vision of all the chairs with Philip, and as we began to go through the process, you see these chairs communicating with you slightly differently. You see them a diversity in approaching the study guides, a diversity of kind of tackling work, but the work was still done at the end of the day. And it took me a minute to kind of realize that, okay, hang on, these people are still getting their jobs done. I can still trust them. Just because they're not necessarily using an approach that I have either advocated for or I personally believe in, doesn't mean that I should try and nudge them or push them in a different direction from what they're already going down. And so that kind of helps me a lot to accept this, because I'd worked with much smaller teams before, and working with such a huge team and such an international team as well. You get loads of different outlooks, and so it did kind of help me develop sort of that trust in delegating these kind of things to other people, and ability to just kind of accept different practices and different styles of work.
Sort of gives you that open mind when it comes to being more flexible and working with bigger teams of different perspectives, I guess. Then, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you for those points. Before we address some of the questions from the audience, because I can already see we have one, I'm just going to have some specific, more like speaker-specific questions to each one of you. And then if we do have the time, we will address the questions from the audience as well. So I want to start with Anthony. I know this is a bit of a stalking question, which is going to make me look like I stalked a little bit about you. But I kind of did the same with Olivia, so I guess it's understandable. So I know you also sing in LSE, and which is a bit of a different format of an extracurricular activity compared to the MUN. So do you think it is important that people who are so much immersed in MUN, like yourself, and I think it's fair to say that for you, or for most of us here actually, to have other extracurricular activities that you are actually taking part in, that you are actually sparing your time and energy in?
Absolutely. I think obviously MUN is the extracurricular that I've dedicated most of my time outside of my degree to, just given the nature of the work. But a lot of time, people who do Model UN are a little bit guilty of just becoming being a part of a big bubble that doesn't really interact with anyone outside of that bubble. And I think it got popped for me when I was in a meeting where I was chairing at a much smaller regional conference in the UK, and I mentioned, "Oh, I'm doing Live-18," and they said, "Where's that?" "Leicester." And at that moment, I realized, oh God, I've just been kind of like talking in this echo chamber of people who go to these kind of conferences and all of that, and it was a little bit of a reality check. But through things like singing in LSE's choir, it's a remnants of my former drama and theatre days in high school. And yes, I'm part of that massive subsection of people who went down the pipe from theatrical to MUN. But it's really good because you just meet people who you can't really constantly talk to about Model UN. And it forces you to keep that diversity of interests, to take up different opportunities, and to ultimately just meet people with different interests that you can still get along with. So you don't end up contained to this sort of Model UN bubble of predominantly IR students that sometimes you end up just getting a little bit lost in.
Definitely. I mean, actually, it's quite similar to what Olivia had mentioned as well, which is another episode that we did with her. But she was also pointing out that aspect of it's important that you do something else which you literally do only for your own, mental benefit as well, not just because of, the competition and then other motivations that are possibly there. So it actually ties a little bit to her point there as well. But thank you. It's indeed quite interesting. I know you mentioned that the focus of many conferences, and I'm using your words here, is misplaced. Could you open up a little bit and tell us what you mean by that misplaced, or how should, I guess, MUNs revise themselves? I don't know if I'm using the right words here, but I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that misplacement that you referred to.
No, very gladly. I mean, I think the third point I was actually going to mention is in a way what Anthony just pointed out, that it's quite a big bubble, and I think that's sort of a relatively neutral way of putting it. I have found that at MUNs, our bubble also, in the sense that there's in some places sort of this very exclusive, the very, very exclusive opinions about who goes to MUNs, who is at MUNs. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine who was actually also organizing a conference with me. We were at a social at the conference, and then people are asked, or people came up to her and asked her, how many MUNs she had done, and she hadn't done any before. So she said, "Well, this is my first," and there was a slightly like a reaction to that, and I think it's a bit. I'm not saying that all MUNers are like that, but I have found that in many ways the MUN sphere thinks that it's a bit too important. I think there's also this impression that also with all these titles like Undersecretary General, Secretary General, etc., look, you're organizing an event. It's a lot of work. Trust me, I've been there. And I think it's nice to recognize that work, but ultimately you are just organizing an event. So maybe a reality check, as Anthony phrased it, would help. Similarly, I think another part is sort of within the conferences themselves. There tends to be, and this is, I guess, more of an opinion that I'm very much willing to, I'm willing to debate most of my opinions, but I think this is an opinion that's more subject to sort of, everyone's personal take. But essentially, I believe that a lot of conferences put the focus on the wrong parts of academics. So if we take academics as on the one side, let's say being sort of more ROP, rules of procedure, aspect, and on the other side being the content as it's presented in the study guides, it's often easier for chairs and for academics teams to simply focus on ROPs. And look, don't get me wrong, ROPs again are important, but I ultimately think that ROPs should be there to facilitate debate on the content, on the substantive parts, and that rather than the other way around, rather than constraining debate on the substantive issues. So there could be, there should be, in my opinion, a bit more of a conscious shift towards the substantive parts. Also, and I was slightly surprised that you mentioned that, Anthony, I feel like there's too little diplomacy, too little negotiations, let's say, within conferences, and too much, debate in a sense. So yeah, I've thrown out a lot. Maybe I should clarify parts of it. Please feel free to.
Just that second point, actually, where you mentioned how the ROPs are sometimes, I guess, overemphasized compared to the substantive side of what should be going on in those sessions. Is that to say playing the game according to certain rules, or just paying so much attention to the ROPs actually sometimes hammering the quality of what's actually being discussed? Was that the point you're making, or am I getting this wrong?
To put it bluntly, yes. To put it bluntly, yeah. I think that sticking to ROPs overly can damage the debate. Obviously, then the question becomes, which ROPs are we using? Because ROPs are not a monolith either. And in what I, as also someone who chairs, would argue are good ROPs, you have a certain sort of discretion for the chair. But ultimately, and I think this goes for everything, the ROPs are there so that people can discuss the topic, not the other way around. And when you have chairs that only comment and only make sure that ROPs are followed, I think that's misguided. It's not wrong, not by any means, but I think that the focus of MUN should be put in other places, because ultimately there's enough of a stereotype that the UN and bodies like it are just bureaucratic messes, and we don't have to reinforce that by acting the part.
Totally agree with you on that, and I'm actually really glad that I brought up that question after all, because the answer was indeed, as you said, multifaceted, I guess I can say, but every point does matter, and I think it does matter so much, especially because that last point, and the reason why I asked was also partially because of this, it can sometimes very negatively impact the delegates' experience as well. And we were actually having a conversation with Alex from MUN earlier today, where he said that they had this, I think, data which suggests that in a lot of the MUN conferences going on right now, I don't know if he said it specifically for Europe or generally for all the other regions that they're following, but at least 50% in most conferences of delegates are first timers. So when you have that mentality of overemphasizing sort of the ROPs and making things more complicated than they should look, and somehow hammering the quality of the discussion, it then in turn also affects a lot of those people's participation in future conferences, which I think is really a remarkable point to make. So thank you very much. Anthony, Darius, as someone who was privileged enough to work with both of you in the past, thanks for joining MUN Talks. It was a pleasure having you here on this platform. And I'm looking forward to hopefully having you here next year as well. Preferably in person, but depending on circumstances, in an online or hybrid format as well. But thank you once again for joining us. It was a pleasure having both of you on this platform.
Thank you very much, Tarek.
Thank you, Tarek, and thank you for the opportunity as well.
Pleasure is ours.